Connie's Chronicles is a documentary-style exploration of one Yorkshire family's hidden history. It's a journey uncovered through dusty historical archives, century-old census records, whispered family memories, and sudden, unexpected DNA discoveries.
Yeah, it actively pulls you in. In 1854, the most important person at Anne Elizabeth Bowser's wedding wasn't actually the bride.
No, and it definitely wasn't the groom either.
Right. It was a woman hiding in the margins of the marriage certificate.
Which is, usually the absolute last place historians think to look. I mean, we tend to focus on the people saying "I do," right? Not the people just standing quietly in the background holding the pen.
Exactly. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're exploring a massive stack of historical sources. We've got 19th century parish records from rural Yorkshire, census returns from 1841 and 1851.
Plus some pretty intense historical context regarding Victorian poverty laws.
Yeah, heavy stuff. And we are using all of this to trace something that is just incredibly difficult to find in the official archives. We're tracking the quiet, unrecorded survival networks of working-class women.
Right, because our mission here is to understand how women who were essentially legally invisible managed to keep their families and each other alive.
And to do that, we're following one specific, just incredibly resilient family line.
We really are.
So if you're looking at marriage record number 156 from Killam Parish Church, this is dated September 30th, 1854, you see the basics, right?
You see the standard legal framework of the day.
Right. You have the bride, Anne Elizabeth Bowser, she's 16 years old, and then you have the groom, Robert Nodal.
And Robert is 31. He's from a place called Burton Agnes, and his marital status is listed with one very heavy word: widower.
Widower, which immediately tells us so much about the practical, unromantic reality of this marriage.
Oh, absolutely.
But as we mentioned, the real story here isn't the bride or the groom, it's the witness line.
Yes, the margins.
Right. There are two witnesses listed. One is a guy named George Thompson, and the other is a woman named Amelia Bowser.
And just seeing a working-class woman's name formally signed as a witness in 1854 is, well, it's a disruption of what we usually expect from these documents, isn't it?
It totally is, because, you have to understand how overwhelmingly patriarchal the English legal and social systems were at this time.
Right. Working-class women in rural farming communities like the Yorkshire Wolds, they live lives of almost total legal invisibility.
Yeah.
There was this legal doctrine called coverture, and that essentially meant that upon marriage, a woman's legal rights and obligations were completely subsumed by those of her husband.
Just erased.
Exactly. She didn't own property. Her wages belonged to him. She didn't sign contracts.
So she just practically ceases to exist on paper.
Basically, yes. When working-class women do appear in the official archives, it's usually passive. Something happens to them.
Right. They're born, they're married off, or they die.
Exactly. The state records those events.
Yeah.
But to stand as a witness in a parish church, to formally step up, take the pen, and guarantee the legality of another woman's union.
That's a huge deal.
It is an active choice. That is deliberate stepping into the light of the official record.
It's literally a signature of support.
Right.
And to fully grasp why Anne Elizabeth Bowser needed that support so desperately at her wedding, we can't just look at 1854.
No, we have to rewind the clock.
We really do. We have to look at the socioeconomic minefield that she was actually born into.
We have to go back 16 years to the market town of Driffield, Yorkshire, in 1838.
1838. Okay, so the sources show us that Anne's mother is a young woman named Isabella Bowser, and Isabella was born in 1822 in Killam to William Bowser and Elizabeth Shaw.
Right.
Now, if you do the math there, when Anne is born in August of 1838, Isabella is only 16 years old.
Just a teenager herself.
Just a kid. And the early records list Isabella's occupation. She is an agricultural or domestic servant.
Which puts her at the absolute bottom rung of the ladder in rural Victorian England.
Let's really unpack the reality of that because, servant sounds almost quaint to modern ears, like something out of a period drama.
Oh, it wasn't quaint at all.
Right. What did that actually mean for a 16-year-old girl in the 1830s?
It meant your life was entirely dictated by your employer. Agricultural and domestic servants were usually hired on yearly contracts, right? Often at these events called hiring fairs or statute fairs, usually around Martinmas in November.
Okay, so you agree to work for a year.
Yes. You agreed to work for a full year, and in exchange, you got a place to sleep. which was often just a drafty attic or an outbuilding your meals, and a very small wage paid at the very end of the year.
Wait, so you have no independent housing and you have absolutely no savings until the entire year is up?
Exactly. You're entirely dependent. Now, add pregnancy into that equation.
Oh, wow.
For an unmarried servant like Isabella, getting pregnant wasn't just a moral scandal, it was an immediate economic catastrophe.
Because they'd fire her.
Immediately. The moment her employer noticed she was pregnant, she would be dismissed. She loses her income, her food, and the roof over her head. Literally all on the same day.
And looking at Anne's birth record from 1838, there is a glaring detail missing. There is absolutely no father listed.
Right. It's completely blank.
Now, hold on. This always baffles me when I'm looking at 19th century records. In a small, deeply rural community where, let's be honest, everyone knows everyone's business, how does the father just vanish from the paperwork?
It's a great question.
Weren't there laws about child support or, making the father pay?
Well, there used to be. And this is where the historical context is so crucial. If Isabella had gotten pregnant just 5 years earlier, the situation would have been very different.
Really? Just 5 years?
Yes. Under the old system, parish authorities were highly motivated to find the father and force him to pay maintenance. Because if they didn't, the parish taxpayers had to support the child.
Right, follow the money. The local taxpayers don't want to foot the bill, so they hunt down the father.
Precisely. But in 1834, Parliament passed the New Poor Law. And baked into this really sweeping legislation was something called the Bastardy Clause.
That sounds incredibly ominous.
It was devastating. The architects of the New Poor Law essentially argued that the old system encouraged vice.
Encouraged vice? How?
They actually believed that because women knew the parish would extract money from the father, they were somehow incentivized to get pregnant out of wedlock.
Wait, really? The government's official stance was that women were having out-of-wedlock pregnancies as some sort of financial hustle.
That was genuinely the prevailing philosophy among the reformers in London. They viewed poverty and illegitimacy as moral failings that needed to be punished, not misfortunes that needed to be managed.
That is wild.
So the Bastardy Clause completely flipped the script. It explicitly shifted the entire financial, legal, and moral burden of an illegitimate child solely onto the mother.
Wow.
It made it practically impossible for a woman to formally pursue the father for financial support.
Imagine your entire social safety net just evaporating because of a single law passed by a bunch of wealthy men in London.
That is exactly what happened. The explicit goal of the state was to terrify women into compliance. The logic was, well, if we make the consequences of an out-of-wedlock pregnancy absolute destitution, women will just stop having out-of-wedlock children.
Which is incredibly flawed logic. I mean, it completely ignores the reality of power dynamics, coercion, or just, basic human nature.
Entirely.
So a 16-year-old unwed servant like Isabella is cast out. She can't sue the father. She has no job. The parish isn't handing out cash anymore. Where does she actually go?
She goes wherever she can find a fraction of mercy.
Yeah.
Maybe her parents in Killam take her in for a time, though they were likely struggling laborers themselves,
Right.
Maybe she relies on siblings or sympathetic neighbors. She pieces together whatever fragile, unrecorded support network she can. But the margin of error is basically zero.
And we know from the sources that whatever fragile safety net she managed to leave, it eventually broke.
It did.
Because we jump forward 3 years and the paper trail picks up again in the most devastating way possible.
The 1841 National Census.
Right. The census takers are moving through Yorkshire, recording where everyone lives, and we find the Bowser family. But they aren't in a cottage.
Okay.
They aren't working on a farm. The 1841 census locates Isabella and her children inside the Driftfield Union Workhouse.
Just the name of the institution tells you everything you need to know about their level of desperation.
Yeah.
Let's look at exactly who is on that bleak ledger in 1841. We have Isabella Bowser, female, age 19. We have Anne Bowser, female, age 3. And we have a new addition to the record, John William Bowser, male, age 6 months.
A 19-year-old girl, a toddler, and a 6-month-old baby locked inside the workhouse.
It's chilling.
Now, I want to make sure we really understand what this means because the term workhouse gets thrown around a lot in, Charles Dickens adaptations, and it can kind of lose its edge.
It becomes a caricature.
Exactly. Entering a Victorian workhouse was not like accessing a modern social welfare program.
Not at all.
The best way I can think to describe it is comparing it to modern hostel architecture. You know those park benches with the metal spikes in the middle so unhoused people can't sleep on them?
Yes.
The workhouse was the institutional equivalent of that. It was a system designed to be so fundamentally unpleasant that you would literally rather do almost anything else than go there.
That is a very accurate analogy. The entirely intentional design philosophy behind the Union workhouses, built after the 1834 Poor Law, was called the principle of less eligibility.
Less eligibility. What does that actually mean in practice?
It meant that the conditions inside the workhouse had to be legally, deliberately worse than the lowest possible standard of living for the poorest independent laborer outside the walls.
So it was a race to the bottom.
Precisely. If a starving agricultural worker was living in a damp, freezing hovel and eating scraps, the workhouse had to be materially worse than that. Otherwise, the government feared lazy people would just flock to the workhouses for a free ride.
It's just staggering cruelty masked as economic efficiency.
It was a deeply punitive mindset. When a family arrived at the heavy wooden doors of the Driffield Union workhouse, they were essentially surrendering their autonomy.
Right.
The first thing that happened upon crossing the threshold was stripping. They were stripped of their own clothes, bathed, and issued rough, scratchy institutional uniforms. This was meant to strip away individual identity and mark them as paupers.
And then comes the actual labor, the work in the workhouse. I mean, what is a 19-year-old mother actually forced to do all day?
Well, it depended on the specific rules of the union, but it was universally monotonous, exhausting, and pretty much pointless. One of the most common tasks for women was picking oakum.
I've heard that phrase before, but what is picking oakum?
It's essentially recycling old naval ropes. They would take these massive, thick ropes from ships that were heavily soaked in thick, hardened tar.
Okay.
The inmates were given a heavy iron nail, and they had to manually untwist the ropes and separate the individual hemp fibers so they could be reused for caulking ships.
Oh, wow. That sounds impossible to do by hand.
It completely tore their hands to shreds. Their fingers would blister, bleed, and split open from the friction and the toxic tar.
That's horrifying.
And they had to meet a specific weight quota every single day. If you didn't meet your quota, your food rations were cut.
Because of course they were.
Other tasks included grueling laundry work for the entire institution, scrubbing the stone floors in absolute silence, or bone crushing.
Wait, bone crushing?
Literally using heavy metal pestles to crush animal bones into dust for fertilizer. It was vile, dangerous work. And keep in mind, they are doing this on a diet designed to keep them just barely alive.
Right, the gruel.
Yes. Gruel, which is basically a watery oatmeal. Stale bread, maybe a tiny piece of boiled meat or weak cheese once a week. The food was weighed out to the ounce.
Okay, so Isabella is exhausted, she's starving, and her hands are bleeding. But for a 19-year-old mother, surely the physical deprivation wasn't even the worst part.
No. The most devastating weapon the workhouse had was psychological. It was the separation of families.
Break that down for me, because we see them all listed on the same census page in 1841. So they are in the same building, right?
They are in the same complex, yes. But the architecture of the Union workhouse was explicitly designed to tear families apart.
How so?
They were usually built in a cross shape or a panopticon layout. There were entirely separate wards and exercise yards for men, for women, for boys, and for girls.
So the moment Isabella walks through the door, they take her 3-year-old daughter away.
Yes. And, being 3, would likely be placed in the children's ward, cared for by an older pauper woman, not her mother. Isabella would be sent to the able-bodied women's ward.
That is just awful. What about the baby?
Now, regarding the 6-month-old baby, John William, workhouse rules usually allowed infants to stay with their mothers until they were about a year old, sometimes 2, depending on the specific union's strictness.
Okay, small mercies.
So Isabella might have been able to keep the baby with her, but she would still be completely separated from Anne.
That is just horrifying. I mean, imagine being 19, your toddler is crying for you in a completely different wing of this massive cold stone building.
And you can't go to her.
You might catch a glimpse of her across an exercise yard during the 1 hour of fresh air allowed, but you are strictly forbidden from speaking to her or comforting her.
Exactly. And if you break the silence rule, you get thrown in a solitary confinement cell called the refractory ward.
And you are enduring all of this while trying to nurse a 6-month-old baby on a diet of watery gruel. The trauma of that environment is almost impossible to quantify.
It really is.
But, this is exactly where the narrative shifts from just being a tragic catalog of Victorian miseries to something incredibly powerful. Because as bleak as that 1841 census record is, it proves something vital.
What's that?
It proves that despite the state's best efforts to isolate and punish them, this family is still surviving.
Yes. The institution classifies them merely as paupers. But the human reality beneath the ink is fierce endurance. Isabella traded her freedom, her dignity, and her physical comfort to ensure that her children had a roof over their heads and food in their stomachs, even if that food was gruel. She anchored them.
I always try to look at what the sources don't say. The census doesn't record the emotional reality, but the timeline does. How long were they actually in there?
That's where the records become a bit murky, which is pretty typical for working-class history. We know they were there in 1841, but we also know they don't stay there forever.
Right, because I'm looking at the timeline, and the sources show that in 1846, Isabella gets married. Back in Killam, she marries a man named Thomas Ibbotson.
Yes.
And by the 1851 census, Anne is a teenager living with her mother and her new stepfather. So my immediate question is, how on earth does Isabella go from being a destitute, locked-up pauper in 1841 to getting married on the outside in 1846?
It's quite a leap.
Did the workhouse just let people out to go dating? The math of that leap doesn't make sense to me based on the strict rules you just described.
It's a great question, and it highlights a common misconception about the workhouse. It wasn't actually a prison in the legal sense. You could discharge yourself.
Wait, really? You could just walk out?
Technically, yes. You could give notice, usually 3 hours, and demand your clothes back. But there was a massive catch.
There's always a catch?
You had to take your entire family with you. The state wouldn't let you leave your children behind for them to feed while you went out looking for work.
Ah, so you can leave, but you are immediately back to square one, starving on the street with 2 kids.
Exactly. So people usually only discharged themselves when they knew they had a guaranteed prospect. Often, this was tied to the agricultural seasons.
Like harvest time.
Exactly. In late summer or autumn, during the harvest, farmers were desperate for cheap labor. The workhouses would often see a mass exodus of able-bodied inmates who left to work the harvest, earn a little money, and try to survive on the outside.
So it's highly likely Isabella took her kids, got out during a period of high labor demand, and managed to scrape a living long enough to reintegrate into the community in Killam, eventually meeting Thomas Ibbotson.
That is the most probable scenario. She leverages a seasonal economic boom to pull her family out of the institutional system. It requires immense grit.
And she succeeds. By 1851, the family is relatively stable.
Which finally brings us back to where we started. It brings us out of the shadows of the 1830s and 40s and back to the quiet nave of Killam Parish Church on September 30th, 1854.
Back to marriage record number 156.
Right.
Anne Elizabeth Bowser, who at 3 years old was shivering in the Driffield workhouse, separated from her teenage mother, has survived. She is 16 years old, and she is standing at the altar marrying Robert Noodle.
The transition she is making at this altar is incredibly stark. She is stepping out of the shadow of a deeply precarious, impoverished childhood, straight into the demanding role of a wife.
And let's not gloss over who she is marrying. Robert Noddle, he's 31. He's the son of John Noddle and Mary Spruce. And he is a widower.
We talked earlier about how the word widower carries weight. Let's examine what that means for 16-year-old Anne.
Yeah, please do.
In a working-class agricultural community, a man whose wife dies is in a state of emergency. He is working dawn to dusk in the fields to earn wages. He cannot simultaneously manage the household, cook, clean, and crucially, care for any young children his late wife may have left behind.
So remarriage isn't necessarily a grand romance. It's an economic and logistical necessity.
Precisely. Robert needs someone to run the domestic sphere of his life. And Anne, at 16, is taking on an immense burden.
It's massive.
She isn't just a young bride starting fresh in a new cottage. She is stepping into a pre-existing household, likely shattered by grief, to manage the labor of a grown man, and she will be expected to immediately begin bearing children of her own. The loss of her childhood is absolute.
It is a huge, daunting threshold for a teenager to cross, and she's doing it through a process called marriage by banns. The sources explicitly mention this. Can you explain what by banns means as opposed to a marriage license?
Certainly. Marriage by banns was the standard, affordable route for the working class. A marriage license cost money, often a significant amount, which allowed wealthier couples to marry quickly and quietly.
Right.
But if you were poor, you had your banns called.
What does calling the banns actually look like?
It meant that for 3 consecutive Sundays before the wedding, the local clergyman had to stand up in the parish church during the service and publicly announce the intention of the couple to marry.
Oh, wow.
He would say, "I publish the banns of marriage between Robert Naudle and Anne Elizabeth Bowser. If any of you know cause or just impediment why these two persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony, ye are to declare it."
So it's incredibly public. The entire village hears about it for 3 weeks.
Yes. It was designed to prevent illegal marriages, bigamy, or marriages involving minors without consent. It put the union under the scrutiny of the entire community.
Okay, so Anne is 16. She's marrying a 31-year-old widower. The entire village of Killam knows about it. She is stepping into a deeply patriarchal legal contract where she effectively signs away her independent existence.
Yes.
It is a moment of profound vulnerability.
Which is exactly why the witness signature is so deeply moving.
Amelia Bowser, we are back to the woman in the margins.
Yes. Amidst all this patriarchal legal machinery, amidst the overwhelming burden Anne is taking on, she is not alone. Amelia Bowser stands up and signs the record.
Now, as an expert looking at this, who exactly is Amelia to Anne? Because we have the same last name, but the sources don't explicitly spell out the exact family tree link at this specific moment in 1854.
And this is where we have to be rigorous historians. We must not claim absolute certainty where only patterns exist. We don't have a single definitive birth certificate saying Amelia is the sister of Isabella or Amelia is the cousin of Anne. But we do have the context. She shares the Bowser name. She is present at a critical public transition for a vulnerable 16-year-old girl.
She is undeniably kin.
Absolutely. Whether she is an aunt, an older cousin, or another female relative, she represents a tangible, physical connection to Anne's survival. Amelia has likely watched this girl navigate the journey from the bleak walls of the workhouse to this church altar.
Think about the power of that presence. We talked about how women acting as witnesses was rare because they were legally invisible.
Yes.
In a system run by men, for men, having a female relative stand beside you and guarantee your marriage is a quiet rebellion against that invisibility.
It is a profound act of solidarity. It is an acknowledgement that while the state, and perhaps even Robert Naudle himself, may view this marriage as the transfer of a woman's labor and obedience to a husband, the women view it differently.
They see it as a continuation of their own network.
Amelia's signature is practically screaming off the page, "I see you! You are not alone! Our family line, no matter how fractured by poverty or the workhouse, holds strong."
And that quiet continuity doesn't just hold strong. In the years following that 1854 marriage, it explodes into life.
It really does.
Let's talk about the sheer scale of the family Anne and Robert build, because the sources lay out a sweeping timeline. Over the next 2.5 decades, Anne gives birth to 10 children.
10 children. The physical toll on a woman's body, beginning in her late teens and stretching relentlessly into her late 30s, is difficult for us to fully comprehend today.
Especially considering the infant and maternal mortality rates of the 19th century. I mean, childbirth was incredibly dangerous.
It was one of the leading causes of death for women, and to survive it 10 times while managing a massive working-class household, cooking, cleaning, mending, and likely contributing to agricultural labor during harvest time.
Yeah.
It requires a level of physical and mental endurance that is staggering.
Let's look at the timeline of these children, because they branch out all across the parishes of the East Riding of Yorkshire. Killam, Driffield, Beverley, Holderness. In 1855, just a year after the wedding, a son is born.
Right.
Then James in 1857, George in 1860, Mary Ann in 1862, a daughter in 1865, Rhoda in 1867, Jane Elizabeth in 1869, another daughter in 1872, Richard in 1874, and finally, Laura Ellen in 1878.
It is a testament to survival. But what is truly remarkable for our investigation is not just the number of children, it is the specific names Anne chooses for them.
Right, and this is where the story gets so incredibly resonant. Because in the 19th century, especially among the rural working class, naming a child wasn't about picking something that sounded trendy.
No. Working-class families possessed almost no material wealth. They couldn't leave behind silver spoons, land, or trust funds. They couldn't build monuments out of stone.
So what did they do?
What they had to pass down was memory. Names were inheritances. They were monuments built of breath and sound, designed to carry the history of the family forward across generations.
So when we look closely at the names Anne chose, we see her actively constructing a monument to the women and the survival networks that saved her.
Exactly.
Let's start with her very first child, her firstborn son, born in July 1855. When Anne is just 17 years old, she names him John William Nodal.
Now, connect the dots backward. Who was the tiny 6-month-old baby boy shivering in the Driftfield Union Workhouse in 1841 alongside 3-year-old Anne and their teenage mother?
His name was John William Bowser.
Exactly.
She gives her firstborn son the exact name of the baby who shared her darkest hours in that institution. It is a staggering connection.
It is.
It's as if she's reaching back through the years into the cold stone of the workhouse, pulling that memory forward and giving it new life and new warmth in her own growing family.
It is a profound act of remembrance, and the pattern continues. We look further down the timeline to June of 1872. Anne gives birth to another daughter. She names her Isabella Nodal,
Isabella, honoring her mother.
the unwed 16-year-old servant who was cast out by society under the cruel logic of the bastardy clause, the 19-year-old who endured the dehumanizing, soul-crushing environment of the Union Workhouse to ensure her children did not perish.
This is what moves me the most. Victorian society told Isabella she was a shameful secret. The state told her she was a pauper. But Anne completely rejects that narrative.
She does.
She doesn't bury the history of her mother's poverty. She elevates it. She inscribes her mother's name onto the next generation.
By naming her daughter Isabella, Anne is making a definitive statement of respect. She is acknowledging that her own existence, her own survival, and her massive, sprawling family are built entirely upon the foundation of her mother's terrifying sacrifices.
Right.
It is a complete rejection of the social stigma that tried to erase Isabella Bowser.
But there is one more name in this family tree that truly reveals the depth and the quiet power of these female networks. We look at the birth of a daughter on January 27, 1865. Anne names her Amelia Nodal,
The reappearance of Amelia.
the name of the woman who stood beside 16-year-old Anne at the altar in Killam, the witness.
It shows us exactly how these survival networks functioned and how deeply they were valued. The woman who acted as a protector, as an anchor in a patriarchal system in 1854, is immortalized a decade later.
Wow.
The name of the wedding witness is carried forward, transforming a single, quiet act of solidarity into a lifelong, living tribute.
And what's fascinating is that if we follow the thread of this new Amelia Nodal, born in 1865, we see how the line continues to weave itself through the fabric of Yorkshire.
This Amelia grows up carrying the legacy of the witness, and the sources trace her path. In October of 1891, at the age of 26, Amelia Nodal marries a man named John Davison.
And even in John Davison's lineage, we see the echoes of deeply rooted local networks, don't we?
We do. John Davison's mother was a woman named Hannah Frank, and that name links back into the established Frankish family network of the surrounding area.
It's like looking at the root system of an ancient forest. You have these webs of working-class families, the Bowsers, the Nodals, the Davisons, the Franks, binding themselves together through marriage, through shared agricultural labor, and through generations of physical presence.
Amelia Nodal and John Davison go on to build their own vast family. They have George Albert, Alice, William, Eva, Fred, Harry, and Hilda.
That's a lot of kids.
It is, but the historical record also captures the complexities of Amelia's life, reflecting the same intricate, sometimes untraditional paths of her own ancestors.
Right, because life doesn't always fit neatly into a parish ledger.
Exactly. The records show that Amelia also had a relationship with a man named Charles Bentley, and from this connection, a daughter is born in 1890.
Her name is Ethel Nodal. Another daughter, another link in the chain. Amelia navigates her own life with its own unique hardships, joys, and complexities, raising Ethel alongside the Davison children.
Yes.
And through it all, we see the story's core theme repeating itself, generation after generation.
It all comes back to how working-class women in 19th century rural England built their monuments. They couldn't leave behind grand estates or thick, leather-bound volumes of memoirs.
No. Their monuments were constructed from flesh and blood. They were built from shared memory and from the deliberate, careful passing down of relationships.
Exactly.
They built monuments to each other by ensuring that a name like Amelia or Isabella or John William did not just end as a rusty ink stain in a dusty parish ledger. They ensured those names were spoken aloud by a child running across the Yorkshire fields 20, 40, or 60 years later.
They carried their support networks forward across generations. They defied the silence and the omissions of the official archives.
When we pull back and look at the entirety of this historical trace, the scale of human endurance is just breathtaking. We began with the profound vulnerability of a teenage servant mother, Isabella, cast into the absolute margins of society by a cruel legal system.
A system meant to break her.
Right. We followed her and her children into the punitive, freezing walls of the Driftfield Union Workhouse, a place explicitly designed by the state to break the human spirit, where we instead found a fierce, anchoring familial love.
We watched Isabella fight her way out of that institution. We walked with Anne Elizabeth out of that shadow, standing as a 16-year-old bride at the altar in Killam, anchored by the quiet, defiant strength of Amelia Bowser's signature.
And finally, we watched that single, fragile line bloom into a vast, sprawling family tree. The Noddles, the Woods, the Welburns, the Phillipsons, the Horners, the Davisons, branching out endlessly across the East Riding of Yorkshire. It is a story of ultimate triumph.
It forces us to reconsider how we consume history. We are taught to look at the written historical record as the absolute truth. But the reality is that the written record is naturally flawed and incomplete. Pages go missing in fires, ink fades into illegibility, census takers make clerical errors, and the lives of the working class, especially working class women, are systemically overlooked and undervalued by the people holding the pens.
Yet what the story of the Bowser and Noddle women shows us is that beneath that fragile, incomplete surface of paper and ink, there lies an unbreakable living continuity.
Yes.
It is a quiet female line, stitched together over decades by a shared instinct for survival, by presence in moments of sheer crisis, and by the fierce, unspoken loyalty of women holding each other up when society tried to tear them down.
It is the history of the negative space, finally brought into the light.
As we wrap up this exploration into Anne Elizabeth Bowser and the women who surrounded her, I want to leave you with a final, gentle suggestion. I want you to think about your own family history.
It's great exercise.
We all have those ancestral charts. We all have the names, the birthplaces, and the death records mapped out in neat little boxes. But look past the bold print. Look at the margins. Who are the quiet, unrecorded presences in your own lineage?
The ones you don't immediately see.
Who are the witnesses, the friends, the unmarried aunts, the neighbors who stepped in when things got incredibly dark? The people whose quiet support, whose timely intervention, or whose sheer physical presence made the survival of your family possible. Their history may not be written in the official history books. Their names might not be carved into marble, but their legacy echoes through the names, the survival, and the very existence of the generations that followed. Thanks for joining us today. Keep looking at the margins.
You've been listening to Connie's Chronicles, Preserving the Past, Connecting the Future.